$500 million. The words ricocheted across the courtroom like a gunshot. For a moment, no one breathed. The journalists clutched their pens. The spectators leaned forward in disbelief. Even the marble walls seemed to echo. The absurdity of the number. $500 million, leveled not at a corporation, not at a billionaire hedge fund, but at one woman, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Judge Thomas's voice had carried with an authority that dripped arrogance, as though he was announcing not a ruling, but a conquest. His gavel fell like a guillotine. To him, this wasn't law. This was spectacle, his moment to remind the world that he still held power, that he could bring anyone to their knees. And what better target than a young black congresswoman who had dared to challenge his unchecked authority? The crowd's reaction was instant and electric. Some gasped, others whispered furiously. Phones lit up as the figure $500 million blasted onto Twitter feeds and news alerts. Outside the courthouse, the number scrolled across giant screens on cable networks within minutes. The public didn't need context to feel the sting. It was outrage served raw. How could a single judge fine an elected representative such an impossible sum? What crime could possibly merit financial annihilation on this scale? And there she was, Jasmine Crockett, sitting just feet away from the man who tried to shatter her future with a dollar sign. Her face was calm to calm. No tears, no bowed head, no theatrics. That composure only sharpened the contrast against Judge Thomas's self-satisfaction. The smug curl of his lips as he leaned back in his chair. It was as if the room split in two. On one side, raw power flaunted itself, daring anyone to resist. On the other, silent resilience radiated like a shield. Even before she spoke, you could feel it. Jasmine Crockett was not finished. Because here's the truth. Judge Thomas never saw coming when you try to bury someone like Jasmine. You don't silence them. You ignite them. And while the courtroom buzzed with disbelief, one thought pierced the chaos like a drumbeat. What would she do next? But Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to bow down. Instead, she prepared a counterstrike that would flip the entire court against him. Asterisk, the figure itself was staggering, but the implications were even greater. $500 million fine wasn't just punitive, it was annihilative. For Jasmine Crockett, it meant more than bankruptcy. It meant obliteration. This wasn't about money. This was about silencing a voice that refused to bow. This was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge entrenched power across me. I'll erase you. Judge Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. Didn't pull that number out of thin air. He wanted it obscene. He wanted it theatrical. Because the more impossible it sounded, the more it crushed the imagination of anyone watching. He wasn't just fining Jasmine, he was trying to brand her as reckless, dangerous, someone who had stepped so far out of line that she deserved a punishment reserved for corrupt empires, not elected representatives. For Crockett, stakes stretched far beyond her own bank account. $500 million meant years of legal battles, endless headlines, painting her as a cautionary tale, and an unavoidable stain on her political future. Colleagues would whisper, donors would hesitate, opponents would seize the chance to define her not as a fighter, but as a felon in waiting. The fine was designed to crush her reputation as much as her finances. But the real danger wasn't to Jasmine alone. The ripple effect threatened every American who ever believed that justice was meant to be blind, that free speech was meant to be protected, that dissent was meant to be heard. Because if a sitting congresswoman could be financially executed for challenging authority, what protection was left for the ordinary citizen? The fine wasn't simply outrageous, it was un-American. Across the country, reactions flared. Civil rights attorneys called it a weaponization of the bench. Commentators on late-night shows compared the sum to the GDP of small nations. Social media exploded with disbelief. $500 million? 4 words? For standing up, the story was no longer about a court case. It had become a referendum on the very values Americans claimed to hold sacred. And yet, in the middle of the storm, Jasmine didn't flinch. Her calmness wasn't resignation, it was strategy. She understood what many watching did not, that every move she made, every glance, every word from this moment on would either cement Judge Thomas's dominance or unravel it. The cameras kept cutting to her face, hoping for fear, expecting anger. What they caught instead was something dangerous for her enemies: quiet determination. Jasmine knew the fine was outrageous. She knew the system was stacked against her. Still, she sat there with the poise of someone already preparing her counterattack. Because here's what Judge Thomas failed to recognize: he wasn't the only one performing for an audience. The country was watching too. And while he thought $500 million would end her career, Jasmine saw the truth. This was the moment to show America that no number, no ruling, no gavel could silence principle. Stakes couldn't be higher. Her career, her name, her very legacy were on the line. But the more the odds stacked against her, the more the country leaned in, waiting. Wondering and Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to disappoint. But before the country even knew the details, Jasmine was already plotting her move, and it would leave Judge Thomas reeling. Asterisk to understand the shock of Judge Thomas's $500 million ruling. You have to understand the man himself. For decades, he has sat on the bench not as a neutral arbiter of justice, but as a monarch presiding over his own fiefdom. The robe on his shoulders became less a symbol of duty and more a shield of untouchability. With every gavel he struck, he reminded those before him that in his courtroom, his word was law. Judge Thomas rose to prominence in an era when power was rarely questioned. He carved out a reputation as the man who would restore order to what he painted as a chaotic society. But beneath that polished slogan was a career littered with decisions that punished the vulnerable and protected the privileged. He had ruled against workers fighting unsafe conditions, sided with corporations accused of poisoning neighborhoods, and dismissed cases where ordinary citizens begged for justice. His defenders called him tough. His critics knew better; they called him ruthless. There was a pattern always the same. When the powerful needed cover, Thomas gave it. When the powerless cried for help, Thomas silenced them. When anyone dared to challenge him, he wielded his bench like a throne from which he could personally administer. Humiliation whispers about his arrogance weren't confined to the courtroom. Clerks spoke of the way he ridiculed them for minor errors. Attorneys described how he would interrupt arguments not with legal clarifications but with sarcastic asides meant to belittle. Once, after a young lawyer stammered nervously, Thomas leaned over the bench and muttered loud enough for the gallery to hear, "If you can't handle me, you shouldn't be here." The laughter that followed wasn't relief, it was fear. Over the years, journalists uncovered ties between Thomas and wealthy benefactors, lavish trips quietly paid for, and friendships with lobbyists whose interests somehow aligned with his rulings. Each revelation chipped away at the image of impartiality, but none of it stuck hard enough to remove him. His defenders dismissed it all as political theater. Meanwhile, Thomas himself leaned into the criticism, wearing it like a badge of honor. "They attack me because I don't bend," he once declared in a speech. What he didn't admit was that he never bent toward the people who needed him most. And yet, despite the mounting controversies, he remained untouchable. Years of deference had built him a fortress of influence. He believed he could fine Jasmine Crockett $500 million simply because he willed it. No checks, no balances, no accountability. It wasn't justice, it was ego crystallized into a ruling. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the sharpest minds. Judge Thomas had grown so accustomed to obedience that he stopped imagining resistance. He mistook fear for respect, silence for loyalty, and his title for invincibility. The irony, of course, was that in trying to bury Jasmine Crockett beneath a mountain of impossible debt, he exposed himself to something he had long avoided: genuine scrutiny. Because the public who watched his ruling didn't see strength, they saw spite. They didn't see dignity, they saw corruption. For the first time in years, the mask slipped, and behind it was not the steady hand of justice, but the clenched fist of a man desperate to protect his fading power. That's what made his attack on Jasmine so reckless. He believed the sheer size of the fine would paralyze her, that the absurdity of the number would drown her in public ridicule. He didn't expect her to stand tall. He didn't expect her to meet his smugness with calm defiance. And he certainly didn't expect that she would take the very arrogance he had displayed and twist it into the rope that would unravel him. because in Judge Thomas's world, arrogance wasn't just a flaw, it was the cornerstone of his identity. And yet, he had no idea that the very arrogance he flaunted would be the weapon Jasmine would turn against him. Before Jasmine Crockett became the congresswoman who would stare down a $500 million fine, she was simply Jasmine, the daughter of a working-class family who knew early on that survival meant more than ambition. It meant resilience. She grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity wasn't promised and where voices like hers were often told to stay quiet, to stay in line, to not expect too much. But Jasmine never learned how to shrink herself. She learned how to fight. Her earliest lessons weren't in politics or law, they were in endurance. When bills stacked up on the kitchen table, when her parents worked long hours to keep food on the stove, Jasmine understood that dignity wasn't something handed down by society. It was something you protected with everything you had. That fierce protection would become the engine of her life. Education was her ticket, but it was never easy. She had to scrape 4 scholarships, take jobs that paid little but drained much, constantly prove she belonged in spaces designed to exclude her. Professors underestimated her. Peers whispered that she was too loud, too direct, too much. Every label thrown at her only confirmed what she already knew, that a system existed to filter out voices like hers before they could rise. So she didn't just rise, she pushed through. She studied law not because it was glamorous, but because she had seen firsthand how the law could suffocate families who lacked the money or power to defend themselves. She wasn't interested in defending the already privileged. She was interested in protecting the voiceless. In courtrooms across Texas, she became known not as the lawyer who softened her words, the one who sharpened them into shields. Clients left her office knowing someone finally believed in them, even when the world didn't. But law was only the beginning. Every victory in court reminded her of the larger battles being waged in state houses and in Congress, where decisions shaped not just one case, but entire generations. When she stepped into politics, it wasn't out of ambition, it was out of necessity. She understood that without representation, people like her would continue to be invisible. Running for office wasn't a career move. It was survival for her community. Her campaign was not backed by deep-pocket donors or glossy consultants. It was built on grit, shoe leather, and the trust she had earned by standing with her neighbors long before ballots were printed. She knocked on doors, not with empty promises, but with receipts proof of the cases she had fought. The family she had defended, the nights she had spent working when no cameras were on her. People didn't just vote for Jasmine Crockett. They invested in her. And when she won, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a crack in the walls that had been built to keep women like her out. Her seat in Congress was more than a title. It was a statement that resilience, truth, and representation could break through, even in a system rigged against them. But Jasmine never lost sight of the weight of her position. Every time she walked into the chamber, she carried with her the faces of her constituents, the families who trusted her to fight, the young girls who looked up at her and saw what was possible. She never softened her voice to make the powerful comfortable, and that, of course, made her a target. Critics labeled her radical, combative, disrespectful. They tried to reduce her to a stereotype, to caricature her passion as chaos. But behind every insult hurled her way was fear that her authenticity couldn't be bought, fear that her backbone couldn't be bent. And Jasmine understood something they didn't. When you represent the unheard, your very existence threatens the status quo. It was that unshakable clarity that carried her into the courtroom on the day Judge Thomas dropped his $500 million hammer. For most, the number itself would have been enough to trigger despair. For Jasmine, it triggered memory. Every kitchen table stacked with overdue bills, every classroom where she was told she didn't belong, every courtroom where she was underestimated. Her life had prepared her to face the unthinkable. She had faced storms before, but nothing like this. Still, every battle had prepared her for this very showdown. Asterisk, the ruling had been delivered, the fine stamped into the record, but the courtroom was far from settled. In fact, the air was heavier than before, charged, restless. as if the walls themselves knew that something bigger was about to unfold. Judge Thomas shifted in his seat, his smug composure flickering for the first time. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, steady as stone. Her calmness an open defiance that made his control feel fragile. The back and forth began subtly. Thomas, irritated by her silence, threw barbed remarks masked as legal clarifications. "Congresswoman," he sneered, his voice dripping condescension. "Perhaps you're not familiar with the consequences of undermining judicial authority. Your seat in Congress does not shield you from responsibility." Jasmine didn't flinch. She met his stare evenly. "With all due respect, Judge, authority is not the same as justice. Responsibility cuts both ways." A ripple moved through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and murmurs filled the air until Thomas snapped, "Order." His gavel struck, but the sound was less commanding now, more desperate. Like a hammer against a cracking wall, frustration colored his cheeks as he pressed harder. "You stand before this court guilty of contemptuous behavior, and if you continue, I will not hesitate to escalate the penalties." This time, Jasmine allowed a pause. She let silence stretch, forcing everyone to lean in. Then, with a voice calm but razor-sharp, she answered, "And if you continue, Judge, you will remind this country why so many no longer trust the courts to serve the people instead of themselves." Gasps shot through the room. It wasn't just defiance, it was indictment. Thomas leaned forward, his voice rising. "You dare lecture this court?" "I dare," she said simply, "to speak the truth." The tension erupted into open conflict. Attorneys objected, Thomas barked orders, but the energy had shifted. Every attempt he made to reassert dominance only deepened the impression that he was rattled. Cornered by a woman he had expected to crush. The more he raised his voice, the more Jasmine lowered hers. Each word calculated, precise, undeniable. "You hide behind numbers," she said at one point, gesturing toward the fine, "but numbers cannot disguise the abuse of power. You find me not because of law, but because of fear of what happens when voices like mine refuse to be silenced." Thomas slammed his gavel again, but the courtroom no longer obeyed him. They were listening to her. His attempts at interruption landed as interruptions to a story everyone suddenly needed to hear. His face tightened, his authority slipping like sand through clenched fists. He spat words now instead of speaking them. "You are out of line, Congresswoman." And yet, she replied evenly, "It seems the line keeps moving every time someone dares to challenge you." The tension was unbearable. Every second stretched taut. Spectators leaned forward. Reporters stopped writing, waiting for what would come next. Judge Thomas, once so sure of his dominance, now looked cornered by his own fury. Jasmine Crockett, poised and deliberate, had maneuvered him into the role of aggressor, while she stood as the calm defender of principle. Then, at the very height of tension, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, and the courtroom fell silent. Asterisk. When the dust finally began to settle, when the outbursts and objections gave way to a rare hush, Jasmine Crockett rose to speak, not as a defendant crushed beneath the weight of an impossible fine, but as a representative of something much larger than herself. Her voice carried not anger, but clarity. The kind that slices through confusion and lays bare what truly matters. "This was never about me," she began, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom.
This was never about a dollar figure, no matter
how obscene it sounds. This was about whether justice can be bought, whether truth can be punished, whether dignity can be stamped out by arrogance. Every syllable landed like a drumbeat. The reporters had stopped scribbling, the spectators had stopped whispering. Even Judge Thomas, fuming behind the bench, could not disguise the way her words claimed the room. "For generations," she continued, "ordinary Americans have been told that the system is too big, too rigged, too untouchable to fight. We've been told that when the powerful decide to silence us, our only choice is to bow our heads. But I refuse to bow. Because the people who sent me here, my neighbors, my community, the families who have lived their lives believing in the promise of democracy, they deserve more than silence. Her words swelled into something greater than defense. They became a reminder that fairness is not a gift from the powerful, but a right earned and protected by those who refuse to surrender it. I stand here fined $500 million, she said, her tone steady, and yet I feel wealthier than ever. Because I have what money cannot buy: the truth, the courage to speak it, and the people who will not let me stand alone. The gallery erupted in applause before the judge could bang his gavel. For once, the gavel was not the loudest sound in the room. The cheers, the clapping, the collective release of a crowd that had been waiting to hear those very words, it drowned everything else out. Jasmine allowed it for a moment, then raised her hand for quiet. Understand this, she pressed on. When arrogance tries to bury you, it's dignity that digs you out. When power tries to intimidate you, it's resilience that carries you forward. And when hate tries to define you, it's the truth that rewrites the story. Her voice lifted now, rising toward a crescendo. This fight is not mine alone. It belongs to every worker who has been cheated, every citizen who has been silenced, every child who has been told their future doesn't count. My story is just the mirror. What you see in it is your own reflection, your struggle, your resilience, your dignity. The power of her words reverberated beyond the courtroom. You could feel it taking root, as though she had reached through the cameras and into the living rooms of millions, reminding them that this wasn't about political titles or legal rulings. It was about who we are, who we choose to be. Jasmine closed her statement with the kind of quiet force that lingers long after the words fade. So no, this was never about me. This was about all of us, and about whether justice belongs to the people, or to the ones who think they can buy it. She let the silence hold for a beat, then added the final line that would echo across headlines and hashtags. And that's why her story isn't just hers, it's ours. Asterisk, she had walked into that courtroom branded with a $500 million fine, framed as a defendant, dismissed as a target. But she walked out having turned the tables, her words sharper than any gavel, her presence more commanding than the judge's robe. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she flipped the courtroom. The same space that Judge Thomas thought he controlled became the stage where his arrogance was exposed and her dignity reigned. That's the story the cameras captured. Got it. But the truth is bigger than one case. What we witnessed was not only a battle between a congresswoman and a judge, it was a test of whether justice belongs to the powerful few or to the people who refuse to be silenced. And when the moment came, dignity proved stronger than arrogance, because at its core, this fight was never about fines or headlines. It was about the values we claim as a nation: fairness, truth, resilience, and the courage to demand them when they're under attack. Jasmine showed us what it looks like when someone refuses to bow to intimidation and instead stands tall for all of us. Now the question is, what about us? Do we sit back and let arrogance define the story, or do we raise our voices to ensure dignity wins? If you believe dignity always defeats arrogance, don't just watch act. Share this video so more people see what real courage looks like. Subscribe so you're part of this movement, and lend your voice to the millions demanding justice that can't be bought, silenced, or crushed. Because Jasmine's story isn't just hers, and together, we're just getting started.